You fool! Warren is dead.
The Bone Grinder and Others. 3 Horrors by Wilford Allen. The Bone Grinder. There was a legend in the mountains of the upper corner of Sonora. If the 4 had ever heard of it, or rather if they had known what gave the legend its basis, probably they would have stayed away. Perhaps, being the adventurers they were, they would have gone the sooner. But they had never heard, never have yet, for of the 4, only 1 came out alive, and he, fearing madness if he allows his mind to dwell on the horrors of that trip, will not let anyone even speak of Sonora in his presence. But among the natives, 99 parts Indian, 1 part Spanish, though they will savagely resent any implication that theirs is not the pure blue blood of the Castilian, the legend was whispered with a fearful crossing of the heart, and an appeal to the Virgin to proceed and follow the whispering. For the legend represented more than a legend to them. It was a very real and present danger, though today, thanks to the good God who had at last answered their prayers and sent the strong-willed gringo to break the power of the Bone Grinder, it is only a legend of past horror. Bert Aldine it was who organized the hunt. Bert was always organizing some sort of a hunt or trip. He had heard that a species of the bighorn was found in scanty numbers in the more inaccessible parts of the mountains of Sonora. Perhaps the horns would not be any finer than those which adorn the heads of the more northerly sheep, but the difficulty of obtaining them was a great charm. So, gathering 3 friends, he made up the party. The little collection of adobe huts which was the point at which they left the railroad was hardly cooler than the rickety train which had carried them down. But it meant activity, and within an hour the 4 had obtained and saddled their horses, including a pack burro to carry the necessary supplies. The sleepy place, which for a time had been disturbed by the unusual intrusion, was again going to sleep, only a few of the natives hanging about to watch the departure, when, with the suddenness of a stroke of lightning, it happened. The first warning was when the other 2 heard Jim Nelson's startled voice. "For God's sake, look at Tom!" Turning quickly, the others saw Jim's brother, Tom, standing beside his mount, his eyes toward the hills behind the little place, his face contorted as though it were the battleground of demons. Before any of the others could move, he sprang on the horse and was off at a mad pace, the few Mexicans in his path scurrying aside to cross themselves as though it were the devil himself who was dashing off at breakneck speed. The very dogs which usually ran yipping and nipping at the heels of one's horse seemed to cower and slink away in terror, as though recognizing the presence of some unseen force. The 3 who were left turned to each other in consternation. It was Aldine who broke the silence, as he leapt toward his horse with a muttered exclamation. The other 2 followed his lead in a flash, when one of the Mexicans who had been in the cowering group stepped forward quickly and grasped Aldine's reins while he spoke with a curious mixture of terror and urgency. "No, senor, do not go. It will be enough that that poor man should die. For now we shall be free for another year. If you go, you cannot save him, and only would it mean that you all should die too." The earnestness of the Mexican's manner, in strange contrast with the evident terror which paled his red skin to a sickly yellow, caused the rider to halt for a moment. Then, without speaking, he tore the reins loose from the trembling fingers of the Mexican, and, turning his horse's head, was off after the fast disappearing figure of Tom Nelson, his companions at his heels. The way the fleeing man had taken did not follow the main trail, but rather a faintly marked trail which was to all appearances abandoned, at least so far as modern travel was concerned. So deeply worn that it had evidently been a well-travelled path at one time, That time must have been long ago, for it was overgrown and so filled in places with gravel wash that it was plain its ancient users had been almost the last to travel over it. Yet, while in its condition it was a dangerous way to travel on horseback at faster than a walk, the flying figure ahead was urging forward recklessly at a pace that was leaving his pursuers far behind, although in their desperation they themselves were far exceeding the speed which ordinary caution would dictate. A half-hour passed, and the small dot moving ahead dodged out of sight around a turn of the ridge, and by the time the three had reached that point, it had seemingly vanished in the distance. Yet they followed on, pausing only in one spot where a sycamore tree showed a spring of water, for they knew too well that it might be some time before they saw another sycamore. The trailing became fearful, for at each turn there was the fear of seeing a dark blot lying beside the trail to tell them that at last the unbelievable luck of the horseman ahead had failed, and that he had been thrown to break his neck in the rocks and chaparral. But no blot showed, and the marks in the untraveled trail where the flying horse had sent the gravel flying showed with unending regularity. Night found them with their own horses exhausted, far into the mountains. The heat of the lower country had disappeared, and the chill of the coming night warned them that they must stop for the night. The fugitive was still ahead, though the hoof marks of his horse showed that it was even nearer exhaustion than their own mounts were. There was little talk about the fire that night. Of the two topics brought up, the first met short shrift. It was Tom's brother who brought it up, and he only asked, "What did that Max say to you, Bert?" Aldine started. Just some of their crazy superstition. But Jim kept on. "I thought I heard him say that Tom would have to die and they would be free for another year. Do you think those Mexicans did anything to Tom?" "I tell you, that was just some of their crazy superstition," Aldine repeated. "How the devil could they have done anything? Something struck Tom, maybe some quick fever, and he went off his head. Better not talk of it unless we have to." And he refused to talk about it any more. Bud Carson brought up the other thing. He pulled on his pipe in the darkness, with his head turned toward the stars, seeming to make his remark to the universe at large, rather than to the others. "The whole damn country is queer. Did you notice that the hills here are all scarred as though rock slides were occurring daily? This may be an earthquake country, for all I know. But did you notice that some of the rocks had not made their trails through the chaparral straight downhill as a rock should roll? I saw one that went horizontally along the side of a hill." Aldine cursed uncomfortably. "Shut up. If you get to seeing things, that's no reason for bothering the rest of us." "It's all right, Bert," Carson answered. "I was just sort of thinking out loud. And I saw you looking at that path of broken brush, so you've got nothing to say about my seeing things." Which was all that anyone felt like saying. In the early morning, they resumed the trail. The remarks about the rock slides were in the consciousness of each, so that they noted the trails through the chaparral which had seemingly been made by some huge boulder being dragged or rolling over the hills. For as Bud Carson had said, the trail did not always lead downward. Finally, coming to where such a trail crossed the path, Carson dismounted to inspect it, remounting with a worried shrug. "Find out anything?" Bert asked bitingly. "Nothing more than you saw. Only something with legs could drag a trail like that, unless they've got perambulating boulders around here." "Find any marks of feet of any kind?" Carson looked off for a moment, as though he had not heard the question, before he answered. "Not a mark. But if something is dragging a big rock around, the rock would wipe out its tracks." "Sure, that's sense. But then, what kind of a thing would it be that would be dragging a 100-ton boulder over these hills for the fun of smashing the chaparral?" "For God's sake, shut up!" Jim's voice came throatily. "We've got to get Tom before it's too late." The sun was on its way down the second day before they found him. All day the strange paths through the brush had become increasingly numerous, and at last the hills seemed to have been ploughed up by the rocks. Rounding a last turn in the trail, they saw ahead a slightly sloping bare spot which occupied an amphitheater in the high hills. The soil seemed to have been stripped off the bedrock, which lay like a great grey floor. It was marked by lines which seemed to be the outlines of the walls of houses, which had been ground down in the same strange manner as the chaparral about. The appearance was so suggestive that the same word came from the mouths of each as they reined up in surprise. Ruins! Anyone who had seen the Pueblo cities of the Southwest Indians could recognize the outline stenciled on the rocks, though of the walls, the buildings themselves, there was nothing left. Forgetting for the time the object of their search, they pressed forward, and in the moment of forgetting, they found it. Near the center of the bare rock floor of the ancient town was a bloody mass which at first they did not recognize. The terrible truth came to the brother first, and he rushed forward with a cry to stop and draw back in horror as he got near enough to see the details. The others pressed on and passed him until they looked shudderingly down on the pulpy mass that had been Tom Nelson and his horse. A trail of blood and ground rock dust led down to where the thing was standing, a huge long boulder, fully 50 feet long and a quarter as high, shaped more like a gigantic worm which had crawled over and ground its victims to death. Nauseated, they looked from the rock to the dead man, then into each other's eyes. There had certainly been no earthquake of such intensity as to move that huge block of basalt, though possibly a weak shock might have passed unnoticed while they were riding. What then had moved that rock, ground Tom Nelson to death? Their horrified speculations were cut short by a cry of terror from the brother of the dead man, who had stayed back, unable to bring himself to approach more closely. They turned toward him, to see him standing as though petrified, the same look of insane struggle on his face that his brother had worn as he sprang on his horse for the fatal ride. Following his glance, they saw a sight which robbed them, too, of the power to move. The huge rock was moving again, not to continue its downward path, but turning as though it were indeed a worm, turning toward them. Paralyzed, they watched until it had turned completely around and was advancing toward Jim Nelson with a remorseless glide, crunching and crackling as it ground the lesser rocks under it to dust. Of a sudden, Carson screamed and ran, followed by Aldine. But Nelson stood still, directly in the path of the oncoming juggernaut. Torn between horror and the necessity for helping Nelson, they hesitated, started, turned, and leapt to his aid. But something interposed itself, something which neither could see, but which barred their path with the unyielding opposition of a solid, immovable body. In an excess of terror, they beat against it, as though against a solid wall, until their fists were broken and bleeding. But it would not yield, and in another instant the realization of the horror broke over them, and they turned madly toward their horses. They were almost beyond earshot in the mad flight, when the stricken cry in the distance behind them told that it was over. 10 minutes perhaps they tore on, 10 minutes that might have been 10 hours. Then Aldine, who had been in the lead, heard the hoofbeats behind him slacken and cease. He turned in time to see Carson turn his horse's head and urge it back toward the town of death. He yelled desperately, but as the other paid no heed, he turned his own horse and followed. The other kept ahead, traveling at the same breakneck pace that Tom Nelson had set the day before. And when Aldine rounded that turn again, he saw Carson standing, already as though by command, in the center of the bare-ground rock. The huge, worm-like rock of death was far off, on the other side of the place, but coming toward the waiting man. Aldine rushed forward, but again met the resistance of the invisible wall. Sagging to his knees beside it, as the horror weakened him, for the first time he saw that the white, stick-like things which littered the bare floor of the prehistoric city were not what he had thought at first, bleached pieces of chaparral, but the remnants of the bones of others from which the flesh had been ground. There were now 2 bloody things, and beside them, in sight but utterly out of reach, Bud Carson stood as though hypnotized, awaiting the same end. For the second time, Aldine turned and fled in mad terror. In that flight back to the little Mexican town, the terror rode behind him. At times it fell back until it was out of feeling, behind the last turn. Again it gained until it was at his elbow. Then it would reach over and touch his neck. Its cold hand would swipe against his face. And, in an added frenzy, he would strike the spurs into the terrified horse, which tore on down the trail with only blind luck to keep it on its feet. When night came on, he did not dare go so fast, but neither did he dare to stop. So, through the night the flight kept on, and at dawn the horse staggered into the town, bearing, it seemed to the inhabitants, a fugitive escaped from hell itself. Far down the track, the morning train was creeping along. In hysterical relief, he swallowed the water which the natives brought him, the while he kept his eyes on the slowly approaching train. He paid no heed to their repeated questions, until finally, as it penetrated his mind that they were asking after the others, he looked straight into their faces with the single word, "dead," at which all fell back and crossed themselves again. The train was nearing, whistling, and he could hardly wait for it to draw up to a stop. So intent was he in watching its approach that he did not note at first the presence of something beside him, until again it reached out and touched his neck, and the chill ran up and down and quivered in his brain. An insistent urge to turn back into the hills came over him, compelling him to turn and move. But the strong personality which made Bert Aldine the leader he was would not die without a fight, and it was reinforced by his memory of the others, ground to a pulp beneath the crunching juggernaut. He never knew how he resisted, but he fought as though it were another being who opposed him, wrestling, striking, crying. The Mexicans drew back in fright, all but a few running into their mud houses to hide. He fought on, but he felt that he was losing. The desire to flee back into the mountains began to drive out the repulsive consciousness of the fate that was waiting there, when help came from a source which he had forgotten. The train drew up with a screech which echoed shrilly in the hills, and in an instant he felt firm hands upon him, holding him down. In the moment the presence was gone, and the train crew, which had thrown him down thinking he was a maniac, decided that he had only had a touch of the sun. His appearance, as he lay limp and colourless like a man suffering from surgical shock, seemed to confirm them in their opinion, so they placed him on the train to hurry him to the doctor down in Hermosillo. As the train vanished down the track, a sudden mania of rejoicing broke out in the little town, as the realization came to the Mexicans that he had actually opposed successfully the spell of the bone grinder. For the legend, coming down from long ago, when the long-dead dwellers in that city of death back in the hills had been wiped out by their fiendish enemy, was that it would have power to take its toll on the country until a day when some man should successfully defy its power. Then it would vanish, and with it even the scars on the high hills over which it had dragged its life-crunching juggernaut. Aldine has never heard the legend, for he knows too much already, and would rather believe that it was a hallucination. The Arctic Death. 1. It was seldom that Charles Brinebar was excited. That he was excited then meant 2 things. First, that the matter was vastly important. Second, that no crisis was immediately imminent, for in a crisis no man was ever more collected than he. Yes, he was speaking in the explosive style which characterized him when excited. If we fail, The whole world dies. And for me it is vengeance as well. Come, look, and listen. And he dragged me to some of his apparatus. Whirling the control dials, he motioned for me to watch a screen. There was a rapid play of lights and shadows, much as though I was looking at the reflection on a ceiling of a water surface disturbed by ripples. Suddenly he reached the right combination. The movement ceased, and there was shown plainly a snow-covered surface, and on it was sprawled the body of a man, seemingly dead. I looked at Brian questioningly. "Yes, dead," he answered my unvoiced question. "That is an old friend, Amos Tobel. Yesterday I got a letter from him. Said he was on a trip up on the Devant. Thought it would amuse me to see him, and so I turned the dials for him. Saw him tramping along. He came on a small animal, dead. Picked it up, seemed puzzled. Picked up another, also dead. It puzzled him. He walked on. Suddenly he stumbled. Seemed to regain his balance, then collapsed. Quite dead. I quickly turned the dials to the Q vibrations. They show up what we can't see by ordinary light, you know. I knew I would see his spirit, but I did not expect to see it struggling with something, trying to get back into his prone body while the thing tried to hold him off. He was forced farther away, farther, and my God, I suppose there is no reason why a spirit should not suffer, but I never expected to see one suffer as he did. But he lost. It was the thing which slipped into the body, but seemed to find it in some way unfitted, for it left and swept away the spirit of poor Tobel, battling. So for me it now means vengeance. Perhaps you recall the sensational tales in the papers some years back of the Arctic death, as they called it. They gained no credence, fortunately. Luckily for the world, it never knew just what the real truth was. All winter, an expanding wave of death had spread fan-like out of the Arctic into the northern interior of Canada, an epidemic in which the lethal agent was unknown. The bodies bore no indication other than the fact of death, and, when found soon enough, the fact that they were frozen like ice. Yet it was certain that freezing was not the cause of death. It was an epidemic of unparalleled deadliness. When a community was stricken, every vestige of life was destroyed. So the tales went. Brian was continuing. Neely of Edmonton was down here last week. Told me the papers tell the truth. So I have been watching it on the screen here. I thought at first it was a medical problem. Then I saw it kill Tobel. It must have been an inspiration, turning on the Q-rays and catching the things in the act. So I spent last night studying it. I think I know what is happening, but I need help. You're game to go with me? Good. It will be dangerous, but you will have the satisfaction of knowing that you are taking a fighting chance. If we don't take it, we shall all be killed anyway. If we take it, maybe... He did not finish, but I could supply the end. The net result of it all was that a few days later, rigged out in warm clothing and wearing a peculiar suit of insulating material with a network of wires and a battery-like contrivance within it, Brian and I set out in his airplane one morning. The machine was also equipped in a peculiar fashion, and we took along several strange implements, the use of which I knew nothing of at the time. To complete the weird outfit, each of us wore a mask which completely covered our heads, with eyepieces which appeared opaque to ordinary light, but were transparent to vibrations of a wavelength entirely outside of the visible range of the spectrum, and which, moreover, so transformed these vibrations that they became visible to us, and the world appeared to us as it must to any organism which can utilize such vibrations naturally. The most peculiar effect of this mask was that the vibration which it admitted being present at night as during daytime, we could see equally well in darkness and daylight, becoming in effect as owl-eyed as we looked. We travelled northward for 2 hours before Brian brought the plane down on the edge of a treeless expanse, and near a little settlement which we found to be a trading post. As we had sped northward in the eerie lighting afforded by our masks, a sense of unreality had grown upon me, which increased rather than diminished when we came to earth and walked the few hundred yards to the little trading station. There we had our first real news of the death. It had not yet reached that point, but that very morning a little Indian village, some 20 miles to the northwest, had been found with its few inhabitants lifeless, their bodies frozen stiff. What had been told in the papers was seemingly true. At least the story which we heard there was just as it had been told in the press dispatches. All morning Brian Barr sat in the shelter of a little tent which we pitched, with a map spread out before him. About us were grouped the curious Indians and the few white people, not more than 20 in all. For some curious reason, the Indians did not seem to be especially fearful. Perhaps the facts had been kept from them. Or perhaps some streak in their makeup caused them to regard fatalistically any threatening danger which they could not see before their eyes. With the whites it was different. They were frankly fearful, and kept plying us with questions, the while Brian Barr was plying them, obtaining information which he carefully plotted on his map. When he had finished with his map, he called the headman, a tall Scotchman named Mackintosh, and motioned for the others to move away. "Mackintosh," he began, "I guess you have it figured out that we have been sent up here by the government to study this plague. We're going right on, and I believe we shall be able to check it before long. But it will take some time, perhaps weeks. In the meantime, we can give you no protection. And I'm going to warn you now. If you value your lives, don't sleep here tonight." He finished in a tone which carried conviction, to me at least. "Gad, mister, what is your name? Mr. Brian Barr, you don't think it will be here tonight?" The tall Scotchman who spoke like an Englishman was palpably terrorized, although I took it that it would ordinarily take quite a bit to frighten him. "I'm sure of it," Brian Barr asserted. "But what is the thing, and how can it kill us tonight when we are perfectly well now?" The Scotchman's questions were evidently framed more to bolster up his courage than to obtain information. "Don't be a fool, man. Get ready to leave at once. You may be too late now." Brian Barr was looking into the north as he spoke. "See?" he gesticulated, and we looked up along the trail to where a solitary figure had been approaching. It had begun to move erratically, and suddenly we saw it stagger and fall. "For God's sake, man, get your people and run! Don't wait for anything, run!" Brian Barr fairly pushed the Scotchman from him, and he did not have to repeat the command, for before he had finished, the latter was already on his way toward the buildings, calling loudly to his people. Frightened the man may have been, but he was no coward, and was turning away from the opportunity of getting an immediate start to see that the others were warned. Brian Barr turned quickly to me, meantime reaching inside of his clothes to press the catch on his protector. "Quick!" he said imperatively. "Reach in!" He did not wait to finish, but himself reached and, quickly locating the button on my suit, pressed it with a sigh of relief. "Now we're safe. For God's sake, never let anything touch that battery now." He turned and looked toward the people who were streaming from the post in terror-stricken flight toward the south. "Poor devils. I'm afraid it's too late for them. Nothing we can do for them now but hope." So it wasn't true what the reports said, that the death came only at night. I wondered. It didn't seem... Before he could finish, the rearmost straggler, an Indian woman with a baby, staggered a few paces and fell motionless. At her cry the others turned, then, shrieking, broke into wilder flight, but in vain. One after another fell, as though a machine gun burst was sweeping them. The last to go was the Scotchman, gigantic among the shorter Indians. He displayed the most tremendous vitality, fighting as though in the grip of invisible assailants. Finally he, too, pitched forward, dead. During it all we had been powerless to aid. Although I had no idea nor plan, I had started forward, but Brian Barr restrained me. "Stay here. They have to die." He was speaking in the jerky fashion peculiar to him when he was stirred. "Hundreds more. We only make right moves. Stop it, before it kills thousands. But not now." I felt his muscles quivering as he gripped my arm, and knew that only his judgment was holding him back from following the same impulse to help the doomed fugitives. But, I objected, if we can protect ourselves, can't we do anything to help them? God, not a thing. No more than Canute could hold back the sea. Beyond hope, unless we reach their center, paralyze that, there is no hope for the world. The center, we must. If not... And he stopped, as though afraid to think farther. Then, suddenly, I seemed to see in the weird light of the mask an advancing wave of transparent formlessness, moving along in the manner of a cloud of gas on a battlefield, but not with the wind, against it. And it did not seem to have the consistency of a vapor, but of something more solid, like a gelatinous mass which rolled along and engulfed the fleeing figures. It was impalpable, for it had passed over us without my having detected its presence in any way. Yet, as it reached and touched each doomed fugitive, it struck him instantaneously with the finger of death, all but the Scotchman, who had seemed to sense its existence as an entity, and tore desperately at it for a moment before he, too, pitched forward. And through it all I felt absolutely nothing, except the sensation of awful chill, which was at first pressed back into the submerged part of my consciousness by the awfulness of the happenings. But after the last victim had fallen stark, it returned to dominate completely my impressions. I asked Brimebar if he too felt the chill, but his only reply was a harsh, naturally, a sardonic gleam in his eyes as he said it. And then I noticed that our plane was covered with glistening ice crystals, as though it had been chilled below the dew point of the air so that frost was forming upon it. Hurrying over to the post buildings, I found that there, too, the frost was forming over everything, and even water in containers which had been liquid in the warmer air of the interior of the houses was solidifying as I watched it. A horrid thought came to my mind, and I rushed to the bodies, hoping that I was mistaken. My horrified fear was justified. Every body, although but a few short minutes before it had been warm with life, was frozen stiff, so cold that the fingers on touching it were burned as by the touch of liquid air, and the flesh had taken on a horrible yellowish, half-transparent appearance. Brimebar had followed me around, observing my actions with that terrible half-amused gleam in his eyes, as though he already knew what I would find, but he ventured no statement beyond a short answer when I asked him, in horror, "For God's sake, what is it?" "You might call it what the papers do. The Arctic death," was all he said. He suddenly became all impatience again, and hurried me on. I wanted to stay long enough at least to get the bodies under a covering of earth. There is something in human nature which rebels against leaving the dead of one's kind for the beasts to mouth. But Brimebar would not hear of it. 2. We climbed again into the plain and advanced into the treeless plain by short stages, with frequent side flights. At the halts between the short flights, Brimebar would take readings with a metallic thermometer, which was a part of his equipment, entering the results on his map. I noticed the figures which he put down, and in spite of the feeling of intense cold, I was surprised at the degree of cold which they indicated. In a region where 40 degrees below zero is a mark reached only once or twice a winter, if that often, the temperatures which he was recording fell within the first few hours lower than 200 Fahrenheit degrees below zero. It seemed incredible that we could live in such a temperature, and I realized that it was only due to the protection of the insulating suit which I wore that the cold did not freeze me in an instant. Out of curiosity, I took the thermometer and placed it within a few inches of my body, as I had noticed that Brimebar laid it down, then walked away several feet to remove the influence of his body, to remain away 2 or 3 minutes before he returned quickly, and read it as though afraid he could not reach it quickly enough to get the correct reading. I was not altogether surprised to find that the temperature which surrounded my body, at least within a few inches distance, was much warmer, although quite cold enough, being 35 below at a time when the temperature at a distance of several feet was 205, 180 degrees lower. Finally, it seemed that he had accumulated all the information which he needed, for he drew the isotherms connecting the points of equal temperature on his map, obtaining curves which were distinctly circular in form, with the center definitely located. Pointing to that center on the map, he turned to me. "That's where we've got to go to find it, George. If I'd only—" His words were suddenly cut short, as a dark form sprang from behind us and felled him with the single impact. I turned to face the thing, and the horror which swept over me on seeing that form robbed me of what power I might have had to resist the sinisterly powerful bulk of the Scotchman, whom we had left stiff in death only a few hours before. As it touched me, I was galvanized into activity by the burning cold of the frozen hands, but I was powerless in the resistless grasp. My only satisfaction was in noting that the warmth of my body seemed to cause as intense an agony to him as the searing cold of his touch did to me. He handled me as one does a hot potato, as he trussed me up securely, then turned and as gingerly bound up Brinebar. All this time he had uttered no sound, nor did he do so even when, about to leave, he turned and leered into my face with a hellish chuckle. But the acme of it all came when, as he took his departure toward the south again, I saw that he was accompanied, as by a bodyguard, by ranks of round balls of that gelatinous substance, each about 3.5 feet in diameter, perfectly round and featureless, yet moving, rolling along in perfect order, animate things, possessed of an intelligence. As the import of what my eyes saw began to seep into my brain, the world began to swim around, and I felt myself sinking forward into an ocean of swirling darkness and nothingness. It was hours later when I returned to consciousness, for while it had been in the early afternoon when I had last noted the time, it was considerably after sunset, although still light to me through my mask. Brinebar was kneeling beside me, chafing my wrists. Before we went on from that place, I learned more, for after the narrow escape we had just had, I wanted to know something more definite of what we might expect, and I'm afraid I said so with more feeling than I usually put into my voice when talking to Brinebar. "Now look here," I complained. "It seems to me if we're going to be jumped by dead men and such things, I ought to know more about it than I do." "You're right, George," my friend answered. "I was just thinking that myself. We had a narrow squeak that time. If it had only had the intelligence to destroy our insulation, well, it didn't. It could have touched us in its natural form, but in the body of the tall Scotchman, it had an instrument with which it could easily have eliminated us from the affair." He fell silent, and I was afraid he was going to retreat into his own thoughts again. Just as I was on the point of speaking, he began again. "Well, it shows they are not infallible. They slipped that time, and now that we're on our guard, I think we have a chance, a fighting chance." This time the pause was so long that I did break into it. "But what is this thing, this intelligence you're talking about?" I insisted. "I won't say what it is, only what it might be, although it is all we have to go on, and I'm working on the assumption that the hypothesis is correct," he resumed. "Just suppose there is another form of matter, one we cannot know through any sense nor measure, but one which occupies the same space we do. Suppose that beings exist composed of such matter. Suppose that they are able to disassociate their intelligences from their individual selves, and that those then discarnate intelligences assemble and combine into one great central intelligence, which functions for the entire race of beings, directing them. If you suppose that, you can suppose that if such beings, directed in that manner, are responsible for this eruption of death, the only hope we have is in reaching that central intelligence and somehow influencing it." "But," I interrupted again, "you don't mean to say those were the bowls we saw? It can't be." "Why not? You saw them, and you saw people killed by them. You saw that they and everything they did was inexplicable by the laws of nature as we know them. How else would you explain them?" "Yes, but the intelligence you speak of, how do you know it exists and in that form, and what can we hope to do to it?" I was sinking into the slough of despondency, as the logic of Brinebar's statements was shown to me as I reasoned back. It was inescapably true, it seemed, and as inescapably hopeless. How could we cope with such things, especially if, as he was calmly telling me, they operated under the direction of a pooled intelligence? I could not even hope to hope. Brinebar did not seem so hopeless, for he said, although with considerable gravity, "Someday I can tell you how I know it, sometime when we have more time. Right now, I'm afraid you will see it all yourself before long. I know we have only one hope, one chance. Not much, but we can take it fighting." But my morale was gone, and if I followed and did Brinebar's bidding during the time which followed, it was not because I still harbored the slightest spark of hope, but rather that, believing that we and all other living things were doomed, I was filled with a sullen rage against the things, and a smouldering desire to close with them and die fighting, hurting them as I knew I could hurt, after seeing the thing which had been the Scotchman cringe at the touch of my body. Memory holds only for the high spots of the ensuing time. I moved with Brinebar as in a stupor toward the center of the eerie plain where we began to see, looming up, a single peak of barren rock. More and more of those hellish balls of pestilence passed us, rolling over the snow-covered plain, and I saw that I had been mistaken in thinking they were simple balls without appendages. It was true that there were none except when one was needed for some purpose. Then they were able to throw out from any part of themselves grotesquely shaped limbs to any required length, or so it seemed to us, to whom all portions of the things appeared alike. I might have derived some comfort from the way in which they rebounded in evident distress when they inadvertently approached us too closely. I did get a savage satisfaction from their pain, but I was too deeply steeped in the apathy of despair for any heartening emotion. And the cold grew always more intense. There came a time when Brinebar let the thermometer fall from his numbed fingers after picking it up, and when it struck the ground, metal though it was, it shattered into as many pieces as though it had been brittle glass, so intense was the cold. Did I say we had long since lost the use of our plane? That is easily understandable with such unearthly temperatures. The only wonder, which is still inexplicable to me, although doubtless due to Brinebar's planning, is that we had its use so long. When it failed, even Brinebar appeared to lose hope for an instant, or at least to consider our prospects more desperate. We must win before our strength failed, for of course we were virtually without supplies, except the few rations of concentrated food we carried on us. The one desperate hope to which we clung was to reach the intelligence which was directing the things, before our strength gave out. As I look back now, it seems presumptuous, two men matching strength against the concentrated power of the intelligence of a world. But it was not. It was desperation. The forward struggle became endlessly long and hopeless without end. The death and the cold of the plain and its dreariness entered into the very soul until there was nothing but the consciousness of the endless plain, with its wheeling balls from the outer spaces of hell itself, and back in the darkness of our minds the dull compulsion, vague and intangible, but potent, that we must plod on forever if need be, and reach that bleak monadnock ahead. And under the unreasoning compulsion of that impulse we plunged dumbly on, ever drawing nearer to the goal, yet our progress was so terribly slow. And the balls came thicker. We were constantly jostled by them, and, while they recoiled as though injured by the touch, we also suffered a sharp sting of cold at each impact. So there was room for gratitude even in our numbing minds, when the news of our coming and of the desirability of keeping out of our way seemed to spread ahead of us, and we were given a clear passageway. At last we neared the black-grey rock, and a final crushing despair overwhelmed me, as I saw that the balls were issuing from the rock itself, not from any opening into which we could penetrate. If what we sought was inside that huge pile of unbroken rock, how could we ever reach it? I gave up the last shred of hope, a shred which unknown I must have been clinging to, for I found that I did have it to lose, although an hour before I would have said I had none left. so it was nothing but the automatic functioning of my mind which made my lips form the words. "We're gone now. Do you see those things pass through the solid rock? How can we cope with that?" But while for the last hour or so Brimebar had seemed almost as dispirited as I, his action under what to me was the most disheartening sight of all was surprising, even to me who was almost beyond the reach of surprise or any emotion save despair. He took from his back the nozzle of something that looked like the flamethrowers used by the Teutons in the World War, with a vindictiveness which was unusual in him. Although I could easily understand how it had developed, he turned it against the rock, and to my astonishment the solid mass seemed to fade away. The consternation which his action caused among the animate balls was easily perceptible. They dashed madly around, losing all semblance to spheres as their appendages appeared, and threshed about in all directions. Finally, order seemed to be restored by the appearance of authority, although I could make out none who appeared to take the lead, but the effects of authority were manifest. The balls formed as though to protect a certain part of the mountain, and with a grunt of satisfaction Brimebar turned in that direction. I followed him, for the stimulus of action had restored me somewhat. Relentlessly we ploughed through their ranks, and strangely, the ray which issued from Brimebar's projector, with power to annihilate the solid rock itself, had no effect on those hellish balls. But if it did not, we ourselves did. While we suffered from the searing touch as they came into contact with us, our touch seemed 1,000 times as terrible to them. For although their spirits seemed willing enough to die in opposing us, the agony of our touch was so excruciating that it was unendurable, and as fast as they came into contact with us, they would bound away, twisted into all the contortions of extreme agony. So, in effect, our progress was unopposed as we first forced our way through their ranks, then bit into the solid rock behind them with the ray. 3. After what seemed an infinity of slow progress into the depths of the old mountain, advancing into the tunnel which we were cutting into the living rock, we suddenly broke through into a blinding radiance. A blinding light in which we blinked, unable to perceive the source of the radiance. Finally, adjusting our eyes to the unaccustomed glare, we advanced and came upon it suddenly. It was not what I had been prepared for. In fact, I was unprepared for anything. Certainly unprepared for a thing which had no form, for it had no dimensions of any kind, at least none measurable by our standards. It was a blinding point of light, suspended in a great chamber, or at least situated in the air in its center, with no visible means of support. One minute point of light which, while having no single color one could name, yet seemed to give the impression of all vivid colors. One tiny point of energy so great that it flooded a vast chamber of many million cubic feet with a radiance positively blinding, even at its confines exceeding the radiance of the noonday sun. After the first glance, which again blinded me for the moment, I did not care to look at it directly again, for it was quickly evident that the point of light was the thing we sought. It spoke no language. How could a point of light without body or vocal organs speak? Yet we easily received the message it sent, and, conversely, its answers, registered in our minds, showed that it understood our thoughts, though it had no ears to hear with. And as the realization of the fact came to me, I again thought to myself, how can we contend with an intelligence which reads our very thoughts? For it said, or at least the thought was communicated to us, "What do you expect to be able to do here?" And the thought echoed in my brain, "Nothing." The voiceless message went on. "Now that you have seen me, how do you expect to destroy me, whom you cannot touch nor injure with your machine, which is only contrived to annihilate matter such as you know it? It cannot touch us." No. The voice of Brimebar startled me as he spoke aloud, though the thing had no ears. "But I have another weapon which can harm you." "You mean, could harm me if you could come close enough?" The intelligence seemed to reprove him. You cannot get close enough to get in range. I saw by the sudden dejection which had come over my friend that what it said was so. The weapon, whatever it was, had a range far too limited to reach the height of that dazzling point of light. We were limited by the necessity for something material to stand upon, while it was not. The next words from the thing, if I can call such thoughts words, were sickening with their revelation, even though what I had already seen must have prepared me for them. The thought came, "You want to know what we mean to do. We here in our situation in the universe find our state unsatisfactory. We see you and your world, so wonderful, and you living in it like brainless brutes. So we are trying, by the only means we have, to leave our world and enter yours. You must not think we are murderers. We are simply a higher form of life supplying our needs. You do not call it murder when you kill a steer for food, for clothing." "Yes, I know what you're doing," Brinebar interrupted harshly. "But I will not grant the cases are parallel. We hold that you are not justified, either by your law or ours, that you are committing murder without the justification even of necessity, just to gratify a foolish wish, which if allowed to become a fact will bring the destruction not only of us, but of your race as well." Again, the answering thought came, irritably this time. "You forget that it is the law of the Maker himself, he whom you call God, who directs all things, that there shall either be progress or death. This is progress." And back came the answer from the man, with no slightest hesitation. "While you're talking of the Maker's law, why do you not remember that he created our world separate, closed all the normal means of communication from one to the other? Do you not think it was with a purpose? You think you can break those laws and not suffer? What about the one of your race who entered the body of the Scotchman, Macintosh? You know how he was changed to a devil incarnate. You cannot break the law separating our worlds and escape. If you persist, you can only bring destruction to all. Enough of this." The answering thought was sharp with anger. "We will not argue. We are acting, and you cannot prevent it. But in a short time you, too, will be dead. We cannot harm you now, but we can wait while you cannot. And I can wait very easily when the prize is your body, Brinebar." The meaning of that last sentence nauseated me, but it must have brought a different thought to Brinebar, for the thing, reading his mind, warned sharply, "Don't think you can influence me in that manner." And then began a debate even stranger than what had gone before, for I heard only one side of it, but there was no difficulty in supplying the missing side. Brinebar no longer spoke aloud, contenting himself with thinking. "I warn you, you cannot succeed," the thought came into my mind from the thing. A short pause, with Brinebar's rejoinder only having an existence in his mind and the thing's. Then again, the thought, "Oh yes, Brinebar, I should have thought of that. Your mind, joined with mine, it would be the richest acquisition I have known. But you are deceiving yourself if you think you will have power to sway my decisions. It is you who will be overwhelmed." The meaning of it began to seep into my brain, and I turned to Brinebar with a start. "For God's sake, what are you going to do?" I asked, knowing in advance what the answer would be. And although I did know his answer, yet I could not repress the shudders of horror as he answered sharply. "It is our only chance. I believe I can dissociate my own intelligence and join it with that thing of intelligence. Then, well, we can see. We're lost if we don't, maybe lost if we do." "But," I objected, "how are you going to do that?" "I think I can. It will help me all it can, for it will always welcome such acquisitions. It said so plainly." He was silent a moment, then broke out suddenly. "Now you just concentrate on one thought. Whatever happens, keep willing that it have no control over you. Will as though your life depended on it, which it will, that your intelligence remain in your own body. Never drop the thought for a moment until it is over. Remember." "Yes, but you—" I was beginning again, but he interrupted me fiercely. "Keep still and hold that thought." The forcefulness of his utterance seemed to paralyze my faculties for the time. I was shaking as though with a violent attack of buck ague, as I tried involuntarily to follow his instructions. But I could not, for suddenly I felt him go limp beside me and slump to the floor. Dropping to my knees, I was horrified to find that there was no pulse to his body. He was as dead. Then began a time which was the most terrible I ever experienced. The horror of the attack by the frozen body of the old Scotchman was nothing in comparison. I was not old at the time, only 36, but when I returned finally from that experience under the bleak monadnock, my hair was white and my hands shaking as with palsy. At first I was unable even to imagine what was happening. The light began to behave erratically, although I received no brain impulses from it such as it had sent before. It seemed to expand until it filled the entire room, then contract to the size of a pinpoint. Rhythmically it swelled and shrank, pulsating, and while I could not see clearly in the radiance, I did obtain the impression that the balls themselves recognized the strangeness of what was taking place. For they had arranged themselves in concentric circles, rank on rank, centered about that spark of ultimate glory, and if they had possessed limbs which could have been designated arms, I would have thought their attitude was that of prayer. How long the horrible glory of that happening lasted, I do not know. I was completely lost in it, forgetful of the admonition which Brimebar had given me. But the recall came with a shock, for suddenly it seemed there was something pulling at my senses, as though something were being drawn from my brain. With a burst of horror, I remembered Brimebar's last words, and began to oppose my will to that which seemed to be bent on drawing the very life from my body. And then it spoke again, while great drops of perspiration ran from my forehead into my eyes, cold, though the chamber was with a cold like that of space. "You have lost." The thought came clearly. "I have Brimebar here, and he has been submerged. It would be better for you to come, for it would be for you eternal life as an intelligence. You must come." And still I fought against the idea, the thing itself, my being revolting against the coming desecration of life. And a sudden gleam of hope came as I seemed to hear dimly in my consciousness a smaller thought, encouraging. Hold out for a time. And somehow I did hold out a while. But there is a limit to the strain that human nerves can bear, and imperceptibly I slipped over the margin. The remainder of the awful experience does not lie within the memory of observed fact. It has the seeming of a dream, however, of such convincing reality that I am firmly convinced that it happened in all of its impossible details. For I seemed to be looking down upon our bodies, mine and Brimebar's, which lay huddled in a heap against the wall, while in my consciousness was a veritable riot of conflicting thoughts. The sickening realization seemed to come to me that I had failed, and that my intelligence had been sucked out of my body into the being of that parasitic thing of souls. As the nausea of that knowledge began to wear off, I became conscious of some of the thoughts which were surging through the ether, and I was surprised to find that all was not harmony within that pool of intellect, for there were two factions. And as I began to get my bearings, I recognized that the outstanding intellects among the pool still retained some of their individuality, and that, instead of all being drawn from that strange plane of life and matter, there were many that represented intelligences which had once had human form. Then it became evident that the dominant faction which had argued so cavalierly with Brimebar had made another slip when it thought it could absorb and submerge his mind within itself. For it soon developed that the other faction needed only the leadership which Brimebar now supplied to spur it into triumphant action. The following time, hours maybe, or minutes, is indescribable. I can only chronicle its results. At last, after a space of time the length of which I have not the slightest idea of, harmony was again restored, and sanity with it. Realization had been forced even on the most radical element of the reservoir of intelligence that, to pursue the mad course it had embraced, would so disrupt the working of both worlds that all beings in both would inevitably be extinguished. But in the struggle, I must confess, I played the part of an onlooker. And then quiet was restored, and Brimebar was again speaking to me in that mysterious, wordless way, Only one of us could return to life as we had known it, and he wanted me to be the one. Frank terror in my awful surroundings combined with his arguments about my family, and I yielded. So Charles Brinebar, greatest scientist of all, greater than any will ever know, passed on. And, lest you regard him as a pathetic figure, a martyr, let me insist that such is emphatically not the case. For it is given to me, who knew him and his zest for adventure which drove him to penetrate the mysteries of nature farther than any man has ever done, to know that he did not die, that his intellect, he himself, now enjoys advantages which I should envy, were I half so curious as he. And in the long evenings as I sit before the fire and talk with my maiden, who was his daughter, I see him plainly, endowed now with powers which were denied even to him while prisoned in such a body as mine. And I am quite sure that when I am at work in my laboratory on the experiments which have made me world famous, it is Brinebar who stands beside me, directing. For no brain but his could so directly and surely solve the problems which I have solved, since that time when the Arctic death threatened our existence as a race. The Swooping Wind. The grey little old man sitting so lonely on the rustic bench under the great oaks interested me. He seemed so out of place there at first glance, yet as one drew close enough to note the details of his action, there was a peculiar, indescribable something about him which one learns to recognize about such places. It is always found in certain types, a rather aimless air of gentle contentment. So I sat down beside him, for I knew he wanted to talk. "A very pleasant day, sir," he began at once, politely. "Yes, indeed," I responded. "Rather unusual at this time of year, is it not?" "Not at all, sir, not at all. I venture to say that the temperature today is about 82 degrees, not more than a degree from the normal at this time. And all the meteorological conditions, wind, sky, humidity, all are quite normal, abnormally normal, sir, if I may use the expression." His assertions, while quite dogmatic, were belied by the gentleness of his voice and expression as he spoke. "You're well acquainted with the weather here, I see," I put in. "Rather," he smiled. "I ought to be. Pardon me for speaking without introducing myself, sir. I am William Estridge, Dr. William Estridge. Yes, I know you know me now. And you are?" "Charles Fritwell," I supplied. "I am certainly pleased to know you, sir," he assured me, and I knew he spoke the truth. "It is a pleasure to meet someone with whom I can talk. These people around here," with a shrug, "oh, they mean all right, but one really can't talk to them. I have to do all my thinking myself, and I really miss the exchange of ideas which I should have. Tomorrow I start on my greatest work. But there, I mustn't bore you with that," he finished deprecatingly. I hastened to assure him that I should be most happy to hear him tell of his work, but for the time he had switched off. Then, as suddenly, he began on another tack. "Do you know, sir, there is something that I must tell you. I've never told anyone before, for, well, they always laugh at me. But I know that you will not laugh, so I will tell you. It is surprising how little the run of people can understand when it is outside of the little whirl of their search for the pleasure of the moment," I said. "I shall be very interested in listening to you." I knew you would. He was quiet a minute, several minutes. I had begun to think he had turned off on still another tangent, when suddenly his whole manner changed, and he turned toward me, almost fiercely. "You know me! You know me!" he repeated huskily. I nodded, for since he had introduced himself I knew him, if not before. "Yes, you know me. Every educated person does. I am Dr. William Estridge. It is through my studies that we are able to predict the movement of storms. You were prescient, sir, in grasping as you did, without my speaking of it, that I am acquainted with the weather. I should be, for I was born, put into this world for a purpose, although I was a stupidly long time in learning that fact. And that is what I must tell you. I was just a child when it happened the first time, too young to be expected to realize its meaning. For that matter, who would have read the meaning in a single happening? I shall never forget that day. Never. We lived in the country, and several of us were on our way home after school, across the fields. Crossing the fields was forbidden to me, for a bull of uncertain, perhaps I should say of certain reputation, made that field his stamping ground. But we were going along, singing or talking or playing in the way of children, and altogether forgetful of danger. I think it was I who saw it first, and it was not 50 yards away, displaying all the symptoms of anger. Suddenly terrified, I screamed and began to run, and the others likewise. I think I forgot to say I was the smallest of all, and I was soon outdistanced. The fence was still far ahead, and I lost still more ground by looking over my shoulder continually. It was that which almost was my undoing, for while my gaze was behind me, I stepped into a gopher hole and went down with a turned ankle. Providence had been with me up till then, as the bull for some reason, although obviously angry and pursuing us, was not doing so with a great deal of speed. But there I lay, unable to do anything but crawl along, screaming, and the sight seemed to stir the animal into swifter motion. Then the thing happened. Until that time there had not been a cloud in the sky, not a breath of air that I can recall. But at the instant that the bull began purposely to set after me as I crawled, helpless, along the ground, there was a sudden roar, and from nowhere there was a sudden swoop of wind which enveloped the charging animal in a cloud of whirling dust. In a moment it had gone, and the bull was dashing madly across the field, away from me. Now, sudden whirlwinds can develop, but naturally they cannot develop in such force with such suddenness. They must develop. They cannot spring into being in full force without being preceded by the lesser stages of development. Now that is that, and you can say, as I would say, that such things might happen, a fortunate coincidence that it happened as it did. In fact, I forgot the occurrence for years. I next recalled it after the second occurrence, which was even more vivid. I was past 30 then. In fact, I had done much of my work, and was on a trip through the high passes of the Andes, when it occurred. I was engaged, in fact, on a meteorological reconnaissance for my university. We had reached the summit of the pass, and seeing a level-topped peak of considerable size to the side, I was on the point of turning toward it. Ahead of us, not more than a quarter of a mile, was a party of about 15 men approaching us. My guide seemed a bit worried, and I was on the point of asking them what was the matter when it happened. The sky had been cloudless, though in this case there was a strong wind blowing through the pass at our backs. With the suddenness of a clap of thunder, I again heard the roar, but where the first time it had seemed to have only terrifying force, this time it was of destructive intensity. The sky was as black as though an ash cloud had passed over the sun, and with the roar the wind swooped down. Where we were, there was a strong wind. Ahead of us we could not see. Then, but after the wind had subsided as suddenly and inexplicably as it had descended, and we went ahead to investigate, we could see the effects of its force. Now, I know, I have calculated the strength of the tornadic winds which in the Great Plains can drive a splinter of wood through a tree trunk. It is in the neighborhood of 400 miles an hour. But I tell you that wind, where it struck in force at the spot which had been occupied by the approaching party, did things which no air moving less than thousands of miles an hour could do. Did it, and was gone, and there was no trace left of that party. Still, the precise similarity did not show up at once. My guides were terrified, and ran, and I, fearing to be left there alone, went after them with a gun. I was, in fact, surprised when they returned so meekly at my command, and still more surprised at what they told me. The approaching band were robbers. More, they were murderers, and my guides had notified them, in the way they have, beyond understanding, of sending messages ahead in those mountains, that I was coming. In short, it was to be an ambush, and if they had come up to me, I should have been dead within a few moments. The swoop of the tremendous wind had seemed to my men like the direct intervention of heaven on my behalf. In fact, it was that belief which brought their confession. Now you will see the similarity between that occurrence and the first. In each case my life was saved, when in the natural order of events it should have been lost. He stopped speaking, and I thought he had finished, and started some remark about it, but he interrupted me, and whereas his speech before had been controlled, he now surprised me with a vehemence I did not look for in the quiet-natured little man. You see now? He leaned forward, and his face worked convulsively. You see? Each time to save me. Each time it was the wind which saved me, and my life work was the study of the wind. There could be but one conclusion. I am to make great discoveries in meteorological science, and the elements themselves will protect my life until I have accomplished my work. It must be a great work, to interest nature herself, to set aside her laws in my favor. No other man has had that done for him. That is a most fascinating thought, I put in, but he waved me into quietude as he continued. But the last time, God, there you will forgive me if I seem to blaspheme. If I had my way, I'd damn it all for the mockery it is. But I can't. My God, I'm helpless, just an instrument denied its own life, its own happiness. Soon after that second time of which I spoke, I met a girl. You can guess what happened. Temporarily, I told myself it would be only temporarily, my scientific interests were forced into second place. A second place so far out of mind as to be almost non-existent, for I had already achieved a position in the world. I had already done work which many could not equal in a lifetime, and if I had found the new interest of a real love which should drive that other interest from my heart, well, I could afford to, very well. So we were married, and on our wedding trip went down along the coast of South America, down the west side, intending to return up the other side. But we never reached it. My God, Fritwell! The tears stood in his eyes as he turned to me, although his voice did not reach. Fritwell, I can never forget that night, and that is the reason that in all the years since then I have never been able to concentrate on the work I must do before I'm allowed to die. But tomorrow I think I will manage to start again. But that night, it was a perfect evening of the Chilean summer, and the soft chords of thrumming Spanish melodies floated over the ship as we sat about or paraded the decks. Inside of the dancing salon there was the gleam of eager faces, alight with colour and animation, as the dancers swung to the orchestra strains. We had danced and were outside, looking over the water, with the stars shining down on us from above, and reflected back at us by the smooth black water. We talked low, listening at the same time to each other's voices and to the waltz. It was Sobre las Olas, the prettiest piece in the world when a Spanish orchestra plays it over Spanish waters on a summer evening. If there was trouble in the world, we had forgotten it. There was nothing on the boat save joyousness and youth and love. We were planning. They always plan on their honeymoon, if it's the real thing. And we were planning softly together, and I was drinking in the musical sound of her voice, more wrapped up in it than in the meaning of her words, when it struck. It struck, damn it! It struck! And she knew what it meant to do. For, as all the world seemed to be whirling in the one tremendous swoop of the wind, literally tearing the ship and the sea to pieces and mixing them until only God himself could tell which was sea and which was ship, I tried to clutch her to me. But she struggled to break away, and through the roar of all the gales that ever blew, concentrated at that one point in that moment, somehow, I can't say how, I heard her words. Let me go, Will, let me go. Can't you see, don't you know? You can't have me and your work both. It has come for me. Let me go, oh, let me go. My God, she was right. Right out of my arms it snatched her, and then all was still again. But where there had been 100 hearts, throbbing to life and love, there was now only one, and it was throbbing to hate.
It still does. I hate it. I hate it. What do I want of life now? But I can't die. I am its slave.
Later, I spoke of him in the office.
Oh, Estridge? Yes, he is a nice fellow. What he told you is partly true. At least he was a scientist, and the only survivor of a boat which was lost in a sudden storm with his bride of a few weeks. The rest of it was, well, you could see for yourself he was quite crazy, though harmless. I did not tell my informant, nor had I told Estridge of my experience in the Andes the previous year. We had come to a point in the pass where a cloudburst seemed to have scooped the rock bare of earth, and I noted that my friends crossed themselves. I remarked on it. "Yes, senor," was the response, "but this is the place of the wrath of heaven. It must of necessity be, then, that there is a legend about this place," I said, expecting to draw out another of the place tales one meets with. My friend who was answering laughed nervously, but for the once I must decline to tell the legend. For you see, I believe it, and to your ears should I tell it, it would be unbelievable. You would laugh. "Do I not know that the tongue of Don Pico speaks nothing but truth?" I answered. "That is truth. Well, I take the chance. You saw that the ground was swept bare completely, and perhaps you think a most terrible storm of rain caused it. You would be wrong. It was the wind, senor, and with the dirt it took away 12 men, puff, and no one ever found a coat from their backs. It was 15 years ago, senor. A scientist, an American, was going over the pass as are we, and his rascally guides thought to arrange an ambush with some robbers to share the loot. But for once, senor, heaven in these degenerate days saw fit to perform a miracle like those of the good book. When the meeting was almost at hand of God, it was dark, though there had been no cloud, and a wind such as never the Andes had seen came and struck the robbers and destroyed even the ground they stood on. And, hand of God, in the next moment it was clear and quiet, but the robbers were vanished completely. And the guides were changed men, senor. They confessed and were punished, and now they work in the garden of the church at Lima, doing the work of God. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,